My priorities are as muddled as the ideas for the upcoming Jumanji movie. Not only do I continue to make these reviews that gain only a fraction of attention and require 4 times the effort compared to the Ratchet & Clank videos I do, I also tend to review games that have already been talked about by everyone and their pet goldfish. Splatoon was 3 months late, Forza was a month late, Breath of the Wild was 2 months late. The only time it ever really worked out for me was Guitar Hero Live vs Rock Band 4 because I directly compared the two in a lengthy video in a way that not many had done before. I was going to review NieR Automata, but that came out in the tail end of February, and by the time I'm writing this, it's mid-May. My penchant for playing at least most of the way through and providing an in-depth look at new games instead of summarizing my thoughts based on my first few hours of the game, because those first hours are generally the most polished ones, is a bit of a double-edged sword. I feel more fulfilled, but it comes at the expense of nobody watching it. So instead, I thought I'd do the most counterproductive thing possible and review its predecessor, NieR. Why? Because, well, have you actually played NieR? I was told countless times to play NieR, an underrated classic of its generation with an emotional narrative and gameplay that defied genre, but what I got was a game that just nearly missed the mark. Yep, I went there! NieR, released all the way back in April 2010, is an action RPG hybrid published by Square Enix and directed by Yoko NieR Automata t-shirt Square Enix Taro. It received average scores across the board and sold fairly poorly, which some would probably chalk up to the fact that it came out only a month after Final Fantasy XIII, which probably not only dominated sales, but sullied most people's opinions of the publisher. Either way, it was pretty quickly forgotten, but it did manage to amass somewhat of a cult following throughout the years that praised the game for its unconventional ways in which it portrayed the story and gameplay. Now, I'm not against a game that mixes up a few different gameplay styles and genres. Undertale, one of my favourite games of the past few years, successfully blended RPG combat and bullet hell style shooters. And I'm also a fan of Borderlands 2, a game that takes more than a few ideas from Diablo's loot system and injects it into a first-person shooter. Take two simple genres, mush them together like a child mushes the food on his plate into a horrific amalgamation of processed hell, and you have a game that's possibly greater than the sum of its parts. NieR's mushed up core concept is an action RPG with a few bullet hell inspired combat options, but sometimes it throws that idea out the window and opts to embrace another entirely different genre. There are side-scrolling sections, top-down sections that may as well just be a pure bullet hell shooter, an isometric dungeon crawler, a fucking text adventure of all things, and a Resident Evil style romp through a haunted mansion. You'd think it would be best to stick to the core mechanics as much as possible instead of trying to branch out and cover as many genres and gameplay styles as possible, but to its credit, I always look forward to what NieR was going to throw at me next, in the same way I would look forward to what new and hormone-fueled rampage Persona 5's Phantom Thieves would undertake against those rotten adults. The constant switching of gameplay styles keeps you on your toes and helps prevent repetition, but in hindsight, it would have worked a lot better if the core gameplay itself was at all remarkable. Behind all the fancy genre swapping is an extremely shallow combat system. Press square a few times to do a singular combo, triangle for a stab or whatever, while the triggers and shoulder buttons perform a number of player-assigned actions. Initially, you only have block and evade, confusingly labelled martial arts which leads you to believe you unlock more martial arts later, which you don't, but you eventually unlock magic spells ranging from a small machine gun-like burst of magic to a giant lance that you can charge and aim to a big punchy fist. And there might be some other ones, but I don't remember because those were the only ones I could be asked using. If it weren't for the array of spells, NieR would be the most dull, boring venture into action RPG territory this side of two worlds. You only have one set of combos for each type of weapon: swords, slightly bigger swords, and spears. And beyond that, I ended up only using spears because their triangle attack proved to be one of the only useful things for pushing the swarms upon swarms of enemies out of your way. The square button started collecting almost as much dust as my PlayStation TV. When you're dodging or slicing through projectiles, things tend to get a little more interesting, and some of the attack patterns enemies show are quite challenging to dodge, but even then, when the core combat feels so shallow and stiff, I find myself struggling to care. The meager roster of enemies also puts a damper on things. You're going to be fighting a lot of samey looking shades for most of the game, as well as some robots and a lot of sheep. This game has a weird fetish for sheep. The only time combat becomes anything more than subpar is during boss fights, which I mostly enjoyed. Early on, the boss fight against... Is that a cluster of tits? That's a cluster of tits. Huh. The boss battle against lizard tits was relatively easy, but felt way more interesting than killing herds of samey monsters. And that's at least somewhat true of the rest of the game's bosses, though I had a lot of trouble fighting this big douchebag because I was low on medicinal herbs pretty much the whole time. Actually, that's another thing that kind of irked me. Did this really need to be an action RPG? Not long after starting the game, you're bombarded with menial tasks. Go deliver this thing, go get 10 lots of goat meat, go kill some shadows, all of which you can complete to earn some cash and purchase healing items, weapons, bait, seeds, materials.
This is absolutely the most boring thing in the world, and every time I find a new side quest, further thoughts of suicide find their way into my head.
Fair enough if you want to sell a few healing items and weapons to players, but the rest is just fluff. You need materials to upgrade your weapons, which can only be done by walking all the way over to one particular spot on on the map, or you can buy bait to go fishing for some asinine reason, which, by the way, I would rather rip off my toes and use that as bait for real fishing instead of playing fishing in NieR, or you can buy seeds to plant in the garden near your house, which I had no idea about as the game never informed me about it. I mean, it might have once and I probably missed it, I don't know, but did I buy Animal Crossing? I think NieR would have fared better if it were trying to be the character-oriented hack and slash it feels like it's trying to be, rather than haphazardly throwing little bits of RPG everywhere for the sake of padding. To make all these side quests and farming and whatever else even more repetitive, the world you traverse is smaller than you would think. I could probably count the number of areas you explore on my hands, and most of them are quite short, which I guess makes it more bearable when you have to explore them again in the second half of the game. Oh, my mistake, I meant more boring and monotonous. On their second visit, some areas offer new sections to explore at least, but the scenery quickly becomes repetitive as you feel like you're just going through the motions. All these areas are connected by an overworld that's similar to Ocarina of Time's Hyrule Field, but to NieR's credit, Ocarina of Time doesn't have drifting.
Right into your mind. Deja vu, I've just been in this place before. Higher on the street, and I know it's my time to go. Going new, and the search.
Stupid things like this drifting boar are probably one of the game's few saving graces for me. There's also the aforementioned infatuation with sheep, but I also can't get over NieR's jumping arc. On a technical level, it's as stiff as the rest of the controls, but on a visual level, it's indescribable. I can at least appreciate a good narrative when I see one, though. Unfortunately, NieR isn't one of them. The game opens with an overly long combat section that very quickly wears out its welcome and blatantly spoils all the powers you eventually get access to, in which you appear to be controlling the main character, NieR, the single worst named character in the universe this side of Edge Maverick. At least it was the worst name ever until I decided to name him NieR. NieR is trying to protect his sickly daughter, but his daughter touches this mysterious looking magic book and a black scroll appears over her body, and she gets like super sick. Ridiculously sick. You wouldn't believe how sick, dude. 1,312 years later, the little girl Yona is lying in bed, still afflicted with the Black Scroll, and her father NieR is attempting to find a cure.
My daughter is sick, and my only concern is to give her a better life. I try my best, but I'm only one man. I'm hard like that.
It's also worth mentioning that NieR is probably the most hideous protagonist I've ever had the displeasure of exposing my eyes to. Kinda looks like cartoon Medea from Medea's Tough Love. Is it sad that I know what that is? On his adventure to perform errands for the disease-ridden populace, Yona gets the crazy idea to venture off to the Lost Shrine in search of a MacGuffin. So NieR runs off to find her and picks up a dusty old book that can shoot magic balls at people and has copious amounts of sass. Ridiculously sassy. You wouldn't believe how sassy, dude. Anyway, the book, Grimoire Vice, suggests he and NieR go off in search of the sealed verses which should unlock the power to rid Yona of the Black Scroll. Along the way, they meet a foul-mouthed swordsman named Kainé, who may as well walk around with a sign that has a singular eggplant emoji on it, and Emil, a boy with the ability to petrify anyone he looks at, hence why he wears a blindfold. Not really a fan of either, to be honest. Emil is met a fair way into the game, and within half an hour the game makes out like he and NieR are the best of friends, and it just feels rushed in my opinion. Okay, from here on out, spoiler warning. If you don't want any of this spoiled, click the time on the screen now. And by click the time on the screen, I mean manually find the time yourself because annotations are dead because YouTube is a dying platform. Then there's Kainé. I hear a lot about Kainé being this incredibly strong female character, but she honestly just pisses me off. People love her because she's quiet, reserved, deeply caring despite not actually showing it, but in most cases she's a potty-mouthed hothead who marches to the beat of her own drum, if every beat was a timely F-bomb. I mean, seriously, the game opens with this.
Vice! You dumbass! How can someone with such a big smart brain get hypnotized like a little bitch, huh? Oh, Shadow Lord, I love you, Shadow Lord. Come over here and give Vice a big sloppy kiss, Shadow Lord. Now pull your head out of your goddamn ass and start fucking helping us!
Sheesh! Remind me not to piss you off!
Just because a character swears a lot one moment and acts reserved at another doesn't mean she's a particularly good character. She's honestly quite cliche. I mean, ooh, she was bullied a lot growing up because she was different. Ooh, she's got a shade living inside of her. Ooh, she's apparently a hermaphrodite. Am I a cold, heartless bastard for thinking Kainé's character is cliche and borderline unlikable? And it genuinely pains me to say that because she's voiced by my waifu, Laura Bailey, voice of Rise Kujikawa, the only Persona waifu that actually makes me wish anime was real. I just don't understand why people people like her, or maybe I do understand and I'm just not having any of this cliched nonsense. Let's move on before I receive death threats. Eventually the story starts to pick up as more backstory and lore is revealed. Essentially, at the end of your first playthrough, which I'll explain in a moment, it's revealed that 1300 years ago humanity was stricken with a disease and faced extinction, so they separated their souls from their bodies, gestalts, using Grimoire Weiss and another book, Grimoire Noir. Then they created clones immune to the disease. Replicants. Replicants eventually formed their own identities, while the gestalts, which are actually shades, grew aggressive. So, you're playing as a clone, and you're gonna kill everybody's souls.
That's fucking brutal.
A whole bunch of stuff happens at the end. You fight the Shadow Lord, yes, that's really his name. Game ends. But it's not over. You've only achieved ending A. When you load up your save, you start at the halfway point of the game and it plays out somewhat differently. The end goal here is to get all 4 endings to get the whole story, which sounds tedious, but each playthrough is different enough so that it doesn't feel like too much of a slog. I mean, if I'm gonna be completely honest, I gave up after getting the second ending when I realized I needed to find all the weapons to be able to get endings C and D, which meant doing more menial side quests. Luckily, in this day and age, YouTubers play the game for you. Endings C and D are obtained by picking 2 different choices at the end of your third playthrough. Kainé is more or less dying, so you can either kill her and put her out of her misery, or sacrifice yourself to save Kainé. The thing is, if you choose to sacrifice yourself, you have to sit there and watch as all your progress is erased, all your items and weapons are removed, everything just disappearing, until eventually the save data itself disappears from your hard drive. And what's more, if you start a new game, you won't be able to enter the same name you used before. That's just really, really damn cool for some reason. It's a shame that these genuinely interesting snippets of lore and interesting narrative choices are buried between one of the blandest, clunkiest, confused messes of a game I've played in a long while. The combat is boring, the characters are textbook cliches, the visuals are almost as blocky as Spyro for the PS1, and even though there's a fair amount of variety in the way the game transitions into different genres, traveling back and forth between so few different areas for anywhere between 20 and 50 hours may or may not bore you to tears. It's also a shame that this is set to one of the best soundtracks of the PS3 era, but even the soundtrack isn't without problems as the pieces are short, repetitive, and few in number. NieR is a missed opportunity, one that I desperately wanted to like, but simply couldn't bring myself to enjoy beyond the sheer silliness of it all. However, I'm glad that it exists, because without it we wouldn't have gotten NieR Automata, a game that came along, looked at its predecessor and said, "You were like a baby. Watch this." Bam! Sexy android ladies. Bam! A combat system that's simple but flashy and satisfying. Bam! A story that doesn't take the entire length of the first playthrough to get interesting. I still think NieR Automata falls into the same trap that NieR did. It's an action RPG that would have been better off just being a regular old action game. It's also kinda repetitive, the open world is still quite small, and the game's chip system is easy to exploit, making the game a bit of a cakewalk at times. But the music is a masterpiece. The combat is flashy. The story is emotional, predictable somewhat in its early hours, but by the third playthrough it really starts to hold its own. The lead characters are fairly archetypal but play off of each other very well. Bringing Platinum Games in really helped NieR Automata in the end because the combat is so much better this time around, and that single change alone leaves the original NieR in the dust. My opinions of NieR remain unchanged. It's clunky, frustrating, and it nearly bored me to tears. But if NieR looks even remotely interesting to you, then I do suggest you give it a go and see for yourself whether you enjoy the fragmented gameplay, or at the very least watching a plot summary on YouTube and jumping into NieR Onomatopoeia. This game rights all the wrongs NieR made. Well, nearly anyway. After all these puns, I nearly want to kill myself. Sedge and Dan makes me hungry for potato wedges with sweet chili and sour cream on the side. Sedge and Dan also make high quality videos on a regular basis, ranging from your standard Let's Plays to podcasts and whatever else in between. I highly recommend watching their point of view on Prey. It's a great insight into the game that's well edited and funny, probably more so than my below average videos. Anyway, if you want to laugh, go check out Sedge and Dan. Don't forget to do the usual stuff, like, comment, subscribe, check that alert button, follow me on Twitter, you know the drill by now. Come join our Discord server too, I'm on there a fair bit, so if you want to talk about games or you need life counselling or something, jump on the Vale and come chat with us. Links are in the description. As always, I'm Rove McManus, say hi to your mum for me.